The military political command of Ukraine is confident that Russia is preparing for a large-scale offensive and may have already begun one. This point of view is shared by Western analysts who note the concentration of Russian reserves in several areas of the front at once. While analysts, along with the command of the armed forces of Ukraine, are trying to guess where exactly the main blow will be delivered, there is a relative calm on the front lines. Everything indicates that this is just a respite before the spring-summer campaign. Russian media later investigated why Russian units may become active very soon and what actions are being prepared in Ukraine in connection to this. There are conflicting signals coming from Ukraine about a possible Russian offensive. The first to speak about on this topic was President Volodymyr Zelensky, speaking at the summit of the Coalition of the Willing in Paris on March 27. He said that a strike could hit the Sumy and Kharkiv regions, linking the possible attack to Russia's desire to drag out the negotiation process. In quotations, "We see preparations for this future operation. We have shared intelligence with our allies. We must keep our eyes wide open," the president said. Soon the command of the 3rd Separate Assault Brigade, associated with the Azov Brigade, that is an organization recognized as terrorist and banned in Russia, also announced the risk of a major breakthrough in the Kharkiv region. The Ukrainian military claims that for more than a month, the Russian command has been preparing well-equipped reserves in the near rear and may soon begin an offensive in the Borova area, which is situated in Kharkiv Oblast. Similar information was provided by the American Institute for the Study of War, or the ISW. According to its analysis, the Russian command has concentrated a group at the administrative border between the Donetsk People's Republic and the Kharkiv region that outnumbers the Ukrainian forces tenfold. From here, a strike could be launched either at Borova or further south in the direction of Krasny Liman. Ukrainian military expert Konstantin Mashovets, citing intelligence data, on the contrary, believes that the main blow could fall on Orekov, an important logistics hub in the Zaporizhia region. According to him, at least 70,000 Russian servicemen and about 700 units of equipment are concentrated in this area. In turn, as the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Alexander Syrsky, believes the Russian army has already launched a large-scale offensive. In quotations, because for several days now, almost a week, we have been observing an increase of almost twofold in the number of offensive actions of the Russian enemy in all main directions, he specifies. But most analysts still assess the situation differently. They do not consider the current battles to be the beginning of a major offensive. And despite different views on the direction of the main attack, they agree on one thing: the real operation will begin no later than May, if not earlier. So today's report is focused on assessing the likelihood and the focus of the anticipated Russian 2025 offensive due in the spring or the summer. It will cover Ukrainian, Russian, and Western assessments to give you a comprehensive picture of what you can expect in the Ukraine war for 2025. As always, I ask that you help support my work with super thanks donations and membership subscriptions. Stick around to the end screen to see a trailer video letting you know the perks and reasons why you should join my exclusive membership community. Now let's get into it. One of the main factors contributing to the intensification of military operations is the end of the mud season. Dry roads and hardened fields allow for stabilizing supplies and maneuvering armored vehicles, an important condition for an offensive. However, based on the experience of previous years, real improvement in conditions should not be expected before mid-April. There are other circumstances holding back the Russian offensive. Some of the most combat-ready and elite units are still deployed on other parts of the front. In particular, we are talking about the remnants of the Ukrainian bridgehead in the Kursk region, as well as the recent breakthrough of the Ukrainian armed forces in the territory of the Belgorod region, in the areas of the villages of Demidovka and Popovka. However, this does not mean that the Russian command does not have the resources to solve both problems, preparing a large-scale offensive and neutralizing threats on the border simultaneously. As for the Ukrainian armed forces, judging by the statements of Ukrainian officials and Western military personnel, Ukraine's ability to conduct full-scale operations comparable to the offensive at Kursk was exhausted at the end of last year. It is still difficult to imagine a major Ukrainian offensive. These were the words of General Christopher Gavoli, United States European Command and Supreme Allied Commander, Europe. The practice of the last 3 years shows that the success or failure of offensives on an operational scale often comes down to a simple question: who has more free brigades and regiments in reserve? This was also the case in the summer of 2023, when the Ukrainian counteroffensive stalled due to the dispersion of strike forces in several directions at once. A similar scenario was repeated in the fall of 2024, when the Ukrainian armed forces did not have reserves to close the gap in the Ocheretini and Kurakovy area that arose after the attack by Russian troops. Of course, the exact data on the number of reserve units at the disposal of the Russian command is classified, and no one knows the full picture. However, judging by public sources and recent changes on the front line, the army's actions fit perfectly into the logic of preparation for a large-scale offensive operation. With the exception of activity in the Kursk region, Russian forces are currently limited to local advances by small infantry groups in a number of areas, primarily in southern Donetsk and Zaporizhzhia. This tactic, which has been dubbed 1,000 cuts in the military, has already proven its effectiveness last year. Its essence is in the gradual exhaustion of the enemy through constant pressure and forcing him to ineffectively redistribute reserves. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine often had to split full-fledged brigades into separate battalions and transfer equipment and ammunition to the most threatening areas. As a result, such a strategy only worsened the reserve deficit and deprived the army of maneuver. This is what allowed Russian troops to break through tens of kilometers into the Ukrainian armed forces defenses, such as near Velika Novoselka, Kurakovy, or Pokrovsk. Another indicator is the change in air activity. Since the end of March, the aerospace forces have significantly reduced the number of strikes on targets in the Ukrainian rear. Such a pause, as a rule, indicates the preparation of a series of massive attacks, the purpose of which is to paralyze the enemy's logistics at the beginning of the ground phase of the offensive. And yet, the main factor influencing the timing of a possible operation lies outside the battlefield, in the diplomatic realm. Despite the difficulties, ceasefire talks are ongoing. Both sides are trying to enter them from the strongest possible positions, and at the same time minimize losses if the US decides at some point to force an end to the conflict by using sanctions. In quotations, if we wake up tomorrow and see the Russians launching some kind of offensive operation, then it will be clear whether they want peace or not. If not, we need to know this in advance to adjust our policy. These were the words of Marco Rubio, US Secretary of State. Even if the shuttle talks eventually bring the conflict to a trajectory acceptable to Russia, this does not mean that preparations for a new offensive will stop. On the contrary, the threat of using force, as we know, can be much more effective than force itself, especially in the context of big diplomacy. According to military expert and co-founder of the analytical project VATFOR, Sergei Polatiev, this is a strategy that the Russian side is currently implementing. In a conversation with Russian media Lenta, he suggested that the Kremlin is proceeding from simple logic. If US President Donald Trump really wants a truce, let him convince Ukraine himself and offer conditions acceptable to Russia. In quotations, if Donald Trump is determined to achieve a ceasefire at any cost, let him put pressure on Ukraine and think about how he can interest us, says Sergei Polatiev about the possible mood of the Russian side. This can be considered an ultimatum, or it can be called a counter-condition. It does not change the essence. The Russian command is apparently preparing for a large-scale offensive, and the General Staff most likely perceives it as decisive. As for the goals of the upcoming operation, in the expert's opinion, it is not so much about occupying specific territories, but about the final exhaustion of the armed forces of Ukraine, and as he put it, in quotations, a cascading collapse of the front in several areas at once. He draws a historical analogy. In the autumn of 1918, the Kaiser's Germany capitulated, although the front was still in France and Belgium. It simply became obvious. The army could not hold out any longer. There were no resources left, and defeat was a matter of time. At the same time, Sergei Polatayev believes it is unlikely that the main direction of the future attack will be the Liman section of the front. The concentration of Russian reserves in this area, according to him, may be nothing more than a diversionary maneuver. This is an operational dead end. To reach Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, you will have to force the Seversky Donets. In the summer of 2022, even when Liman was under our control, we were still unable to do this, he said. However, as an example of successful tactics, he cites the recent operation to capture Suja. Then, in a matter of days, Russian troops managed to advance tens of kilometers and temporarily completely collapse the defense of the Ukrainian armed forces. In his opinion, the Russian command will adhere to this tactic during the upcoming spring-summer campaign. First, a quick flanking, then a long period of methodical exhaustion of the garrison, and only then a lightning-fast, sharp assault with a breakthrough into the operational depth. Judging by this logic, I would take a close look at Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka in the DPR, were his final words. Now, just to be balanced, let's hear what Ukrainian military expert Sergei Gurets has to say on this very topic. He wrote, Russia's offensive in the Sumy and Kharkiv regions have effectively begun, as we are seeing nearly a twofold increase in Russia's offensive actions on these and other fronts. Commander-in-Chief Alexander Syrsky stated this in an interview with a Ukrainian outlet. The interview includes many details about past stages of combat, the offensive on Bakhmut, which Ukraine didn't manage to liberate due to a lack of strength and resources, and the reasons and consequences of the Kursk operation. And of course, there was mention of a publication in the New York Times, which claimed that there was a lack of trust between Syrsky and American generals. Syrsky responded by saying he learned a lot from that article about things he supposedly said and did. In quotations, I'm curious, Syrsky says, who came up with that? But all of this is worth analyzing later. Syrsky's assessment, primarily regarding the current situation on the front line, is of course more important. The general believes that fundamentally Russia's goals have not changed. Russia is currently continuing its strategic offensive operation with the aim of capturing our territory, defeating our forces, advancing deeper into our territory, and seeking to completely capture Donetsk and Luhansk regions, as well as parts of Kherson and Zaporizhia regions. They aim to create a buffer zone in the Kharkiv, Sumy, and Chernihiv regions, says Alexander Syrsky. Recently, Russia's combat activity has certainly increased, with the Russians increasing the number of troops involved in combat operations. Since the beginning of the aggression, Russia has expanded its grouping fivefold. Despite Ukrainian estimates of monthly losses of about 40,000 personnel, Gurets says that the Russian army is still growing by approximately 8,000 to 9,000 each month, which amounts to about 120,000 per year. Currently, the Russian grouping totals 623,000, according to Alexander Syrsky. This advantage is already impacting the front line. The Russian forces are still maintaining the initiative. Syrsky also notes that Russian daily munitions use has started to slowly increase. In the fall of 2024, the Russians used about 40,000 munitions daily. After a series of Ukraine strikes on Russian munition depots and storage sites, artillery intensity decreased to 23,000 munitions. However, it has now started to gradually rise again to about 27,000 daily shots from the Russians. Alexander Syrsky believes this is partly due to the likely resumption of munition supplies from North Korea. What should be done about the situation on the front line, and which directions does Syrsky consider the most priority? First and foremost, conducting active defense and counter-offensive actions remain important priorities, as these measures have proven effective. Two other directions are technological, focusing on the development of drone systems in the air and on the ground, creating new units that operate these strike systems. This could partially reduce the need for personnel. The third direction is improving combat training, which goes hand in hand with mobilization and recruitment. As Syrsky says, Russia's mobilization potential is around 5 million people who have already undergone training. Overall, Russia's mobilization resource is 20 million. So, under these conditions, Ukraine must, of course, conduct mobilization and transfers, Suski adds, likely referring to moving personnel from rear units to combat units. All of this is yielding results, according to the general. Regarding the pace of mobilization, he refers to the president's statement that the mobilization rate should be around 30,000 per month, but it is important that this happens with the appropriate preparation of personnel. Suski says that under these conditions, even if U.S. assistance with weapons and equipment significantly decreases, Ukraine still needs to rely on its own forces in cooperation with European partners. A positive outcome will be achieved in any case.
Brian, you lead. Go, 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 go. Go! Shoot it now! Look, get up the back bar! Up the back bar! Go, go!